think,
Yeah.
Jim, the topic for today came up to me, and because you're traveling, and the topic is traveling, and we were talking about different times of our life that we've traveled. We've talked about the difference between traveling for work and traveling for pleasure. But where are you, and why are you there?
Yeah, well, at the moment I'm in Milan, Italy, and last week I flew in from San Francisco to Amsterdam. So this is it's almost a month. It's just under a month total in Europe, and it's about 5 countries by the time I'm done. So,
And the
but
driving, the
the
driving
destination,
factor was
the driving factor is the Rugby World Cup in
Rugby
France.
World Cup, and that's in
Yeah,
France.
yeah, and that'll be the
And
last week, and I'll watch Ireland against Scotland,
that's
which
going to
by the
be
way, Ireland just beat South Africa 2 days ago. A huge upset. So it's gonna be a
wow,
lot of fun. The Irish are
wow,
very happy. The Irish is rated the number one rugby club in the world. But South Africa, everybody thought would knock them off, and they didn't. So it was a
wow,
big deal.
wow.
Big deal if you're
That is
Irish.
huge. Well, you also,
So
but you also have, as I recall, your mom's relatives somewhere, and then maybe some friends. The reasons for going to different countries.
correct. I'll like I said, I'm in Milan right now, and I'll take the train to Zurich, Switzerland tomorrow morning, and then from Zurich, Switzerland, uh, my wife and I'll rent a car, and then we'll drive to Inzanico, and that's where my grandmother's entire family is from. And
Oh, that
that
sounds
this will
awesome.
be the second time I've been there. Inzanico is right above the Italian border. It's in the
Mm,
Swiss Alps,
mm.
and so obviously they speak Italian in that area. And so yeah, it'll be fun. Then we'll just keep driving south through Italy, and then down into south of France, Nice, and then start to drive up through Lyon. Again, the
Nice.
World Cup is going on that time, and then eventually finish the final leg in Paris, and that's where we'll watch the
That's
Ireland
what
versus
that's where the game is. So
versus Scotland. Yeah.
you clear just the way you're talking about that travel, which is it's not a simple logistical challenge. You know, different countries, different modes of transportation. Most people, and maybe we lose sight of this, most people never have that conversation. That's daunting to them. That's way too much. And to you, you talk about it like it's you're having a cookout in your backyard, which means you've done a lot of traveling. You know.
Yeah. Well, last year I was in Poland, so
Mhm.
I have a technical team there. So I visited Poland last year, and then Amsterdam, Poland, London, and then the year before that was Russia. Uh,
Mhm.
so that was an experience right before the invasion. So it
Mhm.
was probably
Mhm.
I was one of the last few Americans, and then before that was COVID. So there's a year break, and then but in 2019, right before COVID, I was in Europe for a month, 8 countries that time, and that was interesting just because I didn't even I had a ticket out in and out of Paris, but I didn't spend much time in France. I just woke up and decided kind of where I'd go. This with modern technology between a cell phone and a credit card, it's pretty easy to travel now anywhere in the
Yeah.
world. It's so different than it used to be, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah. Well, a lot of
yeah,
it's changed. As you know, my dad was an airline pilot, and back in the day, he flew for TWA. And when I was growing up, I had travel privileges as any child of a pilot for TWA. And that meant all kinds of different stuff. But it was also he also spent his life in the Navy. So by the time I knew who he was, you know, when I was a young kid, he'd been almost everywhere in the world. And my
wow.
brother, my older brother's a FedEx pilot, and he has had the same experience also as an Air Force fighter pilot and a captain with FedEx all over the world. I mean, he calls me from the Taj Mahal. He calls me from Anchorage, Alaska. He calls me from Peking, China. It's I just think most people don't live that life.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm
So, what
wrong, but I think
countries did you go to when you were growing up? Did you travel to many different countries? And
we traveled. I was jokingly
because
saying the other.
as your father as an airline pilot, you would get free travel, right? The
I think
family.
it was called non-revenue. I think the fee was $30, and we got to sit in first class. but
Wow.
you only got a seat if there was a seat available. You couldn't like bump someone. You couldn't take a seat from someone. It was a last minute thing, which was. But back then, Jim, if you remember, flying before deregulation, flying was like it was a wonderful experience. I remember
Yeah, it
having
was.
seven
Remember having to dressing up? You had to dress. I remember
dressing
the
up.
first time I was on a.
We
You had
had
to
to
wear like a shirt and jacket, right?
yeah, yeah. And I remember having a 7-course meal in first class with like
Yeah.
Chateaubriand was the main course and lobster
Wow.
tail. And yeah, I mean, it's like flying around in a glorified bus now a lot.
Yeah.
It's they fill them up, you're elbow to elbow. And unless you want to drop a few grand for a first class seat, it's
At least a few grand. Yeah.
yeah,
It's
it's
several grand.
but yeah, I mean, my best friend, my next door neighbor and best friend, his dad was a TWA captain too. So I think we went on our first trip together without adult supervision when we were like 12. I think we went to California to visit my relatives. So that was
Mhm.
like, but the stewardesses, when they used to call them that, they would be made aware. There's two 12-year-olds, their dads are so and so and so and so. So, and they chances are this young lady knew my father because he'd been with the organization for that long, as well as Ned's dad. And so there was a heightened level of, oh, that's Jim's kid. We should probably take care of him, because Jim
Yeah.
takes care of us. It was really
That was your
cool.
dad's name? Your father's name was
Jim,
Jim?
Jim,
Yeah.
yeah, it's Jim. And then back then as well, when we were kids, because my brother ended up being a pilot, so my father and my brother were attached at the hip, telling stories the whole time. We were able to go into the bathroom. They'd open the bathroom door up to block the view of everyone in the cabin, and they'd open the cockpit door, and I would walk into the cockpit and sit in the jump seat behind my dad for takeoff.
Wow. That's
Yeah,
pretty cool.
you couldn't touch that with a 10-foot pole. Now you were talking about the difference between. Well, I said difference between pre-regulation, and then the second one was the COVID thing, because COVID changed travel altogether.
Yeah.
Are you bumping into any of that COVID stuff, COVID talk as you travel?
No.
No, no,
Not at all. Not at all. Yeah.
that's good.
But
That's
but
good.
but getting back to travel, I've traveled overseas a few times. Again, this is the third time for rugby, because I did go to Tonga and Fiji. So I watched the Canadian play, the national Canadian team play the Tonga national game. That was kind of cool. I sat next to the King of Tonga. Because I had a lot of, yeah, I was still playing rugby at that time. So one of my very good friends is Tongan, and he's like the mayor basically. So I
Mhm.
went with him, and that was a lot of fun. And then another very good friend a few years ago, he was from Scotland, so I watched the Scotland play Ireland in Scotland. That was really fun. That was a great experience. And then not that many years ago, recently, I met he was the CEO of Northampton, which at the time won the Premiership, which is like the Super Bowl of rugby and
Mhm.
professional rugby in London or England, or the UK, or the whole area. So we met them, and they invited us back. Actually, the World Cup was in the UK that year, and he said, "You want to come back for the World Cup?" I said, "No, I'm not really interested. I'd rather see professional games." So we ended up going back for. And at the time, they had won the whole championship, so it was a lot of fun, and watched a professional game there. So that this now I think about it, it's like the third or fourth time related to rugby, and then it's just fun because I played, so I know the game. It's like watching a football game to
Yeah.
somebody else. But
Yeah.
also what I like about rugby that a lot of people don't realize this: the difference between rugby and football is it's more like the soccer model. The 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 goal, the entire game is it's about the game first, not the player. We're kind of different than Americans, right? Americans we're much more individual, but your ultimate goal is to represent your country. So
Mhm.
even if you're playing professional rugby, you go back to your native country, and you represent your country. So that's like the most honorable thing you can do is
Mhm.
represent. It's kind of like the Olympics, right? So that's what makes it so exciting. The fact that it's in France this year, last year was in Japan, or the last World Cup was in Japan. So it makes it obviously a lot of energy because it's a European competition, and it's just a lot of fun. The energy is it's like nothing else. Like it's like going to the Olympics.
Yeah, yeah. It's well that the whole culture and patriotism thing and pride in your country and all that.
Yep.
That's a thing, man. That's a tangible thing, and that's part of why traveling is so cool. Because particularly if you're traveling around in Europe, because you're getting a train or a car, and you're in another country like in an hour or two, or
Yep.
depending,
Yep.
right? So you're culture to culture to culture, the food that you get to eat, and the conveniences that we have here that we take for granted. My biggest one was always like, can I have some ice with my fucking water, please? When I get back here, just give me a
You
couple.
know, I have to say, the world's become a lot smaller. Things are not that much different from place to place.
Yeah.
I know that that's hard for people to realize, but no matter where you go, uh, you're going to get a Heineken no matter where you go in the world, right? There's
Mhm.
certain things that are just, and that's same with cost. You know, things are expensive. Nice things are expensive everywhere in the world.
Yeah. Yeah.
But in terms of food, I had some great meals this last week here in Italy, but I've had Italian food in the Bay Area as good as I have in Italy. So
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
it's not like it used to be 20, 30 years ago. And
It's
same with clothing. The world's become so globalized between food, clothing, all those things. Everything it's the same stuff, and especially with China, unfortunately, it's the same crap in each market. Whether you're in a market in Amsterdam or you're in a market in San Francisco, a lot of
yeah, it's
times it's
interesting.
the
It's
same stuff.
interesting when you bring that up. I think about the times I've been to Ireland, which is where my ex-wife was from. That's where the connection is, and her brother's over there. We're still good friends. But when we first went, it was probably in the 19 somethings, late
Mhm.
19s, and it was you walk down Main Street in Dublin, and there's beautiful hotels and a couple of nice restaurants, mostly white and beige faced audience, not a whole lot of brown. Nobody's talking on a cell phone. Traffic's not that bad. Fast forward 15 years, just what you're talking about. We've just
Oh,
kind of
so different.
all these cultures are melding together.
Yeah,
Immigration, emigration. You couldn't get a good meal in Dublin when I went there. You can get some of the best food in the world there now,
right,
but you but
right.
you can't walk on the sidewalk without bumping into somebody. And everyone's on a
Yeah,
cell phone, and the traffic's horrible. And now
yeah.
the color of the population is darkened, like dramatically. And so that's a great point that you bring up. I think about the first time I went over to Europe, after college with a backpack and $400. And my father actually flew me over there. He was the captain of the plane that flew me over
Oh
there. And
wow, that's
yeah,
cool.
that was
What
really cool.
what country did you land in? He was
Paris. We landed
uh,
in Paris in France. Yeah. He was at the end of his career, he was basically deadheading from New York to Paris, and he had an apartment in Paris where he'd hang out for a while. And
mhm.
he loved Paris. He actually went to Harvard to study French and could speak it really well just with a shitty accent. But he
Interesting.
really immersed himself in the culture there. And this young boy from Jamaica Plain, Massachusetts, that grew up with 11 kids and didn't have a car in his house until he was in his 20s, then goes off and just conquers the world, man. And that's
Cool.
kind of why I brought the topic up. Is the first time I ever brought this topic up to a group of people that I was working with for a sales contest. I mentioned going to Amsterdam, and I remember that so vividly because so many people were not interested in going outside of their comfort zone. That was threatening to them, where to me it was just so exciting, the concept of actually doing something like that. We ended up going to Fort Lauderdale and swimming in the ocean for a couple of days. But
Mhm.
I think that goes back to my point, Jim, that I can tell in 5 minutes. You can tell in 5 minutes when you're talking to someone that's been out of the country, and when I do my coaching with young people, and we talk about the concept of college, I've gotten myself into trouble on this one with parents that didn't want me to say what I said, but it's like, no one's ready for college in my experience. We're too young. We're 17 years old. We don't know what the hell we're doing or where we're going. I would say if you could stick a backpack on your shoulders, put a couple $100 in your pocket, and get on a flight to anywhere outside of this country and give yourself 30 days to just travel around. And then maybe you never come back. Some people never come back. Maybe you come back, but when you come back, you're much more prepared. You just got this wide lens vision of so many things that you didn't even know existed before.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
might have heard about them on TV. Maybe you saw them in a movie or something, but it wasn't real. It wasn't
Mhm.
real. how tall these people are, how short these people are, how these people love Americans, how these people can't stand Americans, how to master, the 10 or 15 phrases that you need in another language just to get around and get a meal. I mean, all these things are brand new when you've never traveled before.
Yeah,
And
yeah. I think the other thing you realize too, it's not better or worse. It's just different.
it's
And
different.
I think the other thing that I find fascinating is how, with all these different languages and these cultures, particularly Europe, they figure it out, right? You're dealing with different languages. You're dealing with different measuring systems of temperature, different currencies, all these different things. It's complete chaos, and somehow they figure it out. And that's
Yep.
the other thing that's not that I enjoy that, but you do learn certain skills, how to
Mm-hmm.
communicate with people with very few words. So
Mm-hmm.
you're communicating, like I said, I've been here for about 5 days now, and I've got my local restaurant but I'm not having conversations with them, but people get along. You
Yep.
drink, you have a
Yep.
glass, and I think that's you realize good people are good people. You don't even have to have a language sometimes, a common language. You're exchanging thoughts, but you learn a lot. I think you mentioned Amsterdam. That's one thing did want to share, because you mentioned cell phones and how much that's changed the world, everywhere in the world. I was impressed with Amsterdam this time. I didn't recognize it, and I've been there 3 times over the last couple of years, um, only for a few days each time. But it's a really cool place. That's why
Mm-hmm.
I like it. But this time, my wife and I were just observing a lot of young people, which is
Mm-hmm.
interesting, because there's areas in the Bay Area, I'm sure even in Florida, you don't see a lot of young people, right? So
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of young people, um, and they were just about every chair on the sidewalk and all the restaurants, they're full. They're all full, and they're
Mm-hmm.
drinking. I'm not drinking like getting hammered out of their minds, puking over the place like most Americans drink, right? They know how to drink, right? Because they don't have it's not a 21-year-old laws like we have. So like some of the laws that we create really do the opposite, right? They especially for 18 to 23-year-olds, right? Because you're binge drinking, so you find that they're calmer. They just socialize and drink, and the other thing is that they weren't all on their cell phones. I was
Yeah.
really surprised. I'm
Yeah.
talking about Amsterdam. It's a little bit different here in Italy, but yeah, they just were interacting. It's almost like the 1990s in a way, before cell phones,
It is. Yeah, it
which
is.
which 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 is kind of cool. It really was.
It
You
is
also
kind of
don't
cool.
see the what's the difference? You don't see a lot of you don't see as much plastic surgery, which is kind of nice to see. It's natural. People are more natural. It's like it is.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah. Well, I
it's
think
like it's
I think the cultural differences are astounding. You said something before we started recording about how old things are over there, and it made me think of when I visited my sister. She was studying overseas in a place called Trier, and I want to say that it's the border of France and Switzerland. And I think she was in school. Georgetown's extension program was in Switzerland, but her place of her dwelling was in France, and so she would toggle back and forth. But the thing I remember most about that visit was they were celebrating. We had just celebrated a few years prior our 200th anniversary, the bicentennial back in '76, and this was like '83, 6 years later. They were celebrating their 2000th anniversary.
oh yeah, yeah. That's the thing. That's why I was when I was in Greece a few years ago. Yeah, you walk through those downtown areas of Greece, Athens, or any of those, and you just go, wow, in terms of how young the U.S. is. We're babies compared to these parts of the world, right?
We are, and I
Where
think we lose.
civilization started, and when you lose, and that's the other reason I like to travel. You get perspective.
Mm-hmm.
You start to understand things. Also, there's history there of the rise and fall too, right?
Mm-hmm.
Of
Mm-hmm.
and it makes
Civilization.
you real civilization, and it makes you realize how sensitive things are, how fast they can crumble. And yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because you do get perspective when you're walking through areas that are 500, 600 years old,
Well, here's the other perspective. Not only that, there were Roman ruins there, right?
Yeah,
In the north of France. So what does that make you think? Well, how vast the Roman Empire was,
yeah,
right?
oh
You're
yeah,
in Rome, Italy. That's not the Roman Empire. That's just a little speck on a dot.
I know.
The Roman Empire was enormous. So, and
Yeah,
just spin that up in your head for a second. I mean, I'm in the
yeah,
north of France and I'm looking at Roman ruins. Wow.
yeah. Hey,
So
when I
I
was
think,
in Scotland, I started the medieval uh, castles, and they have their own history of the medieval days, right? And
yeah,
the, that's all within the people that are there, and it happened. And so
yep,
we don't think things are ever going to change, or we don't. I don't think we have perspective in the U.S. of how fragile. That's what I was looking for. Fragile things are politically, and how they shift, and then they go, and then before you know it, you're at war with your
yep,
neighbors, and
yep,
that's what Europe is. It's just it's war after war after war. To even think
yeah.
that this war with Russia and Ukraine right now happened is kind of sad, very sad, because they said it was never going to happen again, and here we
Well,
are,
yeah,
with it again.
I think there's so many geopolitical nuances to that anybody that says they know exactly what's going on is full of shit.
Yeah.
Um, I don't like the idea that we're not doing well economically and we're giving all this money to another
Oh
country
yeah.
and we're not attending to our own country. And I think a lot of these issues are cultural. Some of these issues are geopolitical. Some of them are
Mm-hmm.
based on location. I mean, look, it's Ukraine. It's right close proximity to a crazy guy in Russia. You know, it's like,
Mm-hmm.
but what's going on behind the scenes? You know, we don't
Mm-hmm.
know. We just don't know. Are we feeding the military, industry so we can make more weapons? Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
probably, right? Are we, what's the purpose of this? Is Ukraine really trying to maintain their solidarity, or is there something more going on here? Is this just like a fight between two dudes and they're just
Mm-hmm.
slaughtering young men at their, who knows? Who knows? There's probably some of that. And, and then, I don't think one of the things I did discover when I first went over to Europe was how little we know about European history, right?
Mm-hmm.
We teach American
You're
history.
right. Americans do not know
Yeah, they don't know.
very
They don't
much
know.
about that. Yeah.
And the only reason I know anything about Europe or traveling is because of what my father did for a living. He would come home and tell stories. And
Right.
I got to view the world globally through my dad at the dinner table,
Yeah.
which
Interesting.
probably piqued my curiosity to travel as soon as I could and
Sure.
go see new places. But yeah, we get lazy here. There's a lot of work going on. It's like I was watching this show the other night about different cultures. This one guy spent his lifetime looking for the 5 or 6 places in the world. I think he called them blue zones, where an inordinate number of people live beyond the age of 100. And so
Mm-hmm.
he wanted to study why that was. And what happened was cultural was a lot of it. Like in, I think it was Sardinia in
Yeah,
Italy,
that's
the
what it
island,
was. Right.
one of the islands off of Italy. One of the biggest things was nobody's alone when they're old.
That's what's right.
Their family,
It
they
was
live with
something
their,
to do with some diet,
yeah,
it really was, it was the social
it's important
interaction.
for
Yeah.
our culture that we take care of
Mm-hmm.
our elderly. I don't think we've had that instinct for a long time. We used to.
Mm-hmm.
When I
Mm-hmm.
was in Boston way back in the day, the North End was all Italians, the South End was all Irish, and families lived with families. You had 3 or 4 generations inside of a home,
Yeah.
and that wasn't because they had to. It's because they
Yeah.
wanted to, you know.
Yeah.
So those cultural differences are really interesting to me,
Yeah.
really interesting, whether it's the
Yeah.
food that people eat or in the Okinawa was one of them. I think it was, everybody had a garden, you know, and in
Yeah.
all the places they were getting exercise. They were walking up and down hills or leaning over in the garden working. It was physical. It was food. And it was culture and faith. And,
But yeah,
you know,
well, globalization is taking a toll on all parts of the world. I don't know, where this is going to go, but yeah, there's no question that these countries are losing some of their culture as the
mhm.
world gets bigger, or
Yep.
becomes smaller. I should say, gets smaller.
Well,
And
I think that, we tend to get political without intending to, but I think if the concept of having a border where you can go across the border, but you have to do certain things, you have to have certain paperwork with you. You have to have a purpose. You have to have a destination. This is for the most part for most countries. Some countries, if you go in there illegal, they'll throw you in jail. Some countries you can just walk in. I don't think either one of those is a good option. I think there should be, like, I think we should do things to preserve the Italian culture. I think we should do things to preserve the French culture, so on and so on, right? And I think that
Who's we? We're talking about we as in who? We.
all of us in general, I think
You,
that,
you, you mean humanity or?
yeah, it goes back to the family, right? You take that Italian example I gave you, where there's one woman in this kitchen who doesn't have a husband and she doesn't have any kids, and she's surrounded by friends who she thinks are family for her. The value of family in the preservation of culture and tradition,
Mhm.
and that's what I think. You've just said it a couple times. One of the things you get exposed to, good, bad, or indifferent, is the values of a particular culture, the family values, the traditional. Are we passing down stories from 3 generations, 4 generations ago, or are those stories going to stop being told? I think traveling is opens your eyes to that kind of stuff and appreciation for that kind of stuff. But when are you coming back from your trip?
I've got a few more weeks still, but before we go back, I think I said I've been to Milan before. It's the second time or third time, but when I was married, this is back in the '90s. So yeah, going back when there was no technology to now, what a difference. The one thing I have to say I'm disappointed in Milan is graffiti. Believe it or not, it's a beautiful city, right? But there's graffiti everywhere, and these are not just the bad areas. These are the nice areas.
Yeah.
And I don't know what to think about that. I'm still processing it. Right?
I'm
What is that?
surprised.
Is that a breakdown? These buildings are unbelievably not old but beautiful buildings, and there's graffiti everywhere in the nicest areas.
That
This again.
surprises me.
I'm not. Yeah, I'm really surprised.
Yeah, it surprises me. I think when you ask the question, what happened, I think it's got to be two things, or maybe more, but that's certainly a lack of respect, and I
France
would,
is the same way. France has some of the same problems.
yeah,
But
yeah.
but
Well,
what does that say about society when your own local politicians allow people to randomly just write on these buildings with no disregard? I felt sorry for the people that live here that they
yeah.
had to accept this as the norm. Like you see some buildings like a beautiful storefront and nice like a nice restaurant or a nice clothing store, and then right next to it just graffiti all over the place.
Yeah, I think it's probably a topic for an entire podcast episode, but I think it's two things pop into my head immediately. One is that the younger generation is not bringing the same level of respect to our traditions as older generations. I think that's a stereotypical statement, but I'll stand by it. And I think,
Yeah, but Mark, I think you're onto something. I apologize for interrupting, but it's a sign that you have a generation that just doesn't care, that
mhm,
has no hope. That's what to me that was my conclusion. You have somebody that dislikes their country, they dislike their life, they dislike everything so much they just want to destroy something. That means that we've created a society of people that just don't care,
well,
and
here's the
that's
other side of that
and this
coin.
applies. Say more. Remember, I live in Northern California, and Oakland's just as bad. So
Yep.
it's this is anytime you have graffiti to that degree, it is a sign. It's a sign of some social underlying problem where you have a group of people that just don't care. This is their way
Well, I
of
think it's,
expressing themselves because they don't believe in the system. It's a
yeah,
breakdown.
they're looking for attention. They're lacking in respect and tradition. But you're also, the other side of that to me is nobody's throwing them in jail. Nobody's arresting these people. Nobody's punishing these people. So
That's it.
I think globally speaking, these two things are happening. I don't know to what extent they're attributable to COVID, to technology advancement, to the just the breakdown of the family unit, all of the above.
Breakdown of government, in my opinion. If a government
Both.
allows,
It's both. It's
yeah,
both. You know, look at your description of your trip to San Francisco a few weeks ago, where a 6-block area or whatever was clean and no homeless
Yeah.
people. That's because the private citizenry said, we've had
Yep.
enough of this shit. And so
That's
they're
right.
doing it themselves. And I think that all of these things we talk about, the polarizing issues through different lenses, travel and growing up and sports and all this other stuff, they're all the same. You have the younger generation needs to be held accountable when they act disrespectfully, and the governments and institutions that are academia, government, that are supposed to be doing things to take care of these kids need to step it up notch too. We basically just, everything's diluted to me.
Yeah.
Respect is included, but it's also accountability, you know? So
Yeah, I think there are some similarities to the government, let's just say mentality, or the government ideology of European government, and even parts of the U.S. You know, whether it's Democratic, Republic, I don't know. You know,
yeah, a
what the
lot of them
difference
are,
is,
yeah,
but
they're agnostic. I think I'll throw a blanket on this thing to kind of start wrapping it up, but I also think, dude, that the whole world is full of people in positions of power that are scaring everyone about the climate. They're scaring everyone about the future of the world, right? And you can't scare people in that capacity, particularly when you can't back up a lot of the statements that you're making and you're just emoting. But you put fear into young people that they're not going to be around in 10 years or 20 years. What does that do to them? That starts all this bad behavior. That starts disrespect. Why should I? I'm not even going to be alive in 15 years, you know? Why should I? So I think it's all three of those areas. I think it's young people being allowed to do disrespectful things without being held accountable. I think it's law enforcement and leadership not holding people accountable in higher places. And then I think it's like, why are we scaring everybody? Even if that were true, to what end does it help to scare people? And that's not the only issue that we're scaring people about. So I think what you're seeing in Milan, long story short, is a result of all three of those things. It's kind of
I'll
sad.
report back to you next week because I'll be in Switzerland. I think it's be very different. But two things: graffiti and homeless.
Yeah.
Something that the U.S. has a lot of right now, and that's
Yep.
in all parts of the U.S. So I'm not
Yep.
saying just the San Francisco Bay Area. I've been many parts of the U.S.
But
there is very, I've maybe seen one homeless, but not even homeless. There's some guy asking for money, one in 5 days in Milan. In Amsterdam, zero homeless.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you know, I think you have to ask yourself, if you went into different cities in the United States and even different cities in Europe and different countries, and you see an absence of graffiti, find out why. And there's only 2 or 3 reasons, right? And they're probably all 3 happening. They're doing this right, they're doing this right, and they're doing this right. And when you go into another city where there's all kinds of bullshit going on, they're not doing any of those things. Those things are not given any value. The family, respect for your elders, respect for other people's property. Hey, if you do this bad thing, you're going to get thrown in jail. You're going to get punished, right?
Yeah.
You take all those things out of the equation. Why would anybody give a shit? You know?
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
yeah.
All right, Jim, I'll look forward to hearing from you from Switzerland next week.
All right. Sounds
All
good.
right.
Talk
Travel
to you later.
safe, dude. Peace.
Okay.